mean, unquote. Turner proceeds to comment that it is indeed difficult to see how any man, especially of a nervous temperament, could read Smith's book through without being thrown into some sort of hysterics. The marvel is that it should ever have happened otherwise. It is unquestionably one of the most unreasonably disgusting works in the English or any other language, declared 1844 Reputation. It is less interesting than anything we've ever seen. Filled with such idle vagaries as would disgrace a common scribbler, the most contemptible piece of presumption that has ever come under our own observation, and is an admixture of blackguardism and nonsense. We will poise it against the world. It won't bear any examination in any point, yet we will proceed in detail. Time and again, authors of lengthy exposés and reputations feel they need to apologize for wasting their own and their readers' time on so palpably ludicrous a subject. Alexander Campbell at first, quote, thought it best not to take public notice of it, as the system was so unreasonable and ridiculous that no person of good common sense would believe it. But having witnessed the progress of the delusion among some of our respectable citizens, some of whom were considered worthy members of society, I have felt it my indispensable duty to use my exertion against its spreading and contaminating influence. I would have asked forgiveness from all my readers for even noticing the Book of Mormon, Campbell continues, had not several hundred persons of different denominations believed in it. To make an earnest attack on Mormonism, as if it had any plausible pretensions to credibility, wrote Origen Baxter in the opening of his earnest 1838 attack on Mormonism, entitled Mormonism Exposed, would argue great want of discernment and good sense on the part of one who might thus assail it. It would be somewhat like a labored attempt to disprove the theory of Tom Thumbs, or like the attack of Don Quixote on the windmill. The Book of Mormon was, he said, the most gross, the most ridiculous, the most imbecile, the most contemptible concern that was ever admitted to be pawned off upon society as a revelation. It has no merit even as a forgery. Its author was a blockhead. Still, even if Joseph Smith was nothing but a blockhead, the Book of Mormon existed, and it grounded a movement that was attracting troubling numbers of converts. Clearly, Joseph must have had help. On this, believing Latter-day Saints and their critics could agree. The gross ignorance of this man, wrote James Hunt in 1844 expose of Mormonism, was looked upon by his early followers as his greatest merit, and as furnishing the most incontestable proofs of his divine mission. And gradually the skeptics realized that their own first explanation had to be jettisoned as simply implausible. But believers and critics parted company on the identity of the helper or helpers. While most critics suddenly became willing to imagine a conspiracy of considerable size that may or may not have included Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer and Parley Pratt, Sidney Rigdon, an experienced clergyman and Bible student, a Campbellite preacher before his conversion to Mormonism, was the favored candidate for the role of chief facilitator of what they devoutly believed to be a fraud. The hypothesis received its debut with the granddaddy of all anti-Mormon books, Edward E. Howe's 1834 cult classic, Mormonism Unveiled. But Rigdon was not the absolute author of the Book of Mormon, according to this explanation. He was merely, quote, the Iago, the prime mover of the whole conspiracy, the transmitter to Joseph Smith of a manuscript originally authored by one Solomon Spalding, a Dartmouth College-educated former clergyman who had expressly declared his disbelief in the Bible before his death in 1816. Howe described the Book of Mormon as, quote, unquestionably one of the meanest in English or any other language. It is more devoid of interest than any we have ever seen. It must have been written by an atheist to make an experiment on the human understanding and credulity. The author, although evidently a man of learning, studied barrenness of style expression without an equal. The real author, notwithstanding his studied ignorance, was well acquainted with the classics. The sameness is such in the tautology of phrases from the beginning to the end of the work that no one can be left in doubt in identifying the whole with one individual author. But that author, of course, was no longer that spindle-shanked ignoramus Joe Smith. Now it was the classically educated Solomon Spalding. Howe thought he might even be able to discern in the Book of Mormon the hand of a fearless infidel who had attempted a ridicule upon the Holy Bible, perhaps in a bid to bring down contempt upon the inspired writers in the religion of Jesus Christ. Howe seems to have been aware, however, that he did not have in his possession the evidence that would establish his case beyond reasonable doubt. So he hedged his bets. That there has been from the beginning of the imposture a more talented knave behind the curtain is evident, to our mind at least, but whether he will ever be clearly, fully, and positively unveiled and brought into open daylight may of course be doubted. His modesty was compelled by the striking lack of evidence that today has led most critics ultimately to drop the Spalding manuscript theory of Book of Mormon origins. None of this stopped some critics from actually manufacturing ersatz evidence. In his 1855 book, The Prophets, or Mormonism Unveiled, O.S. Belial is able to furnish his readers with a transcript of the conversation in which the Book of Mormon plot was hatched. Permit me to read from this invaluable document. A conversation between Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, in which they decided upon a plan to print the Book of Mormon. Easily obviated, returned Smith coolly, using the kind of vocabulary, no doubt, that led people to call him an illiterate ignoramus. You know I have the seer stones, and I can make them believe I divined it by them, or what is better still, say a Urim and Thummim, of which Spalding speaks, was discovered with Rigdon. Nothing could be better if we could evade discovery. Spalding, Patterson, and I have read it to numbers of different people, and I'm almost sure they would detect us. Smith, you tell me Spalding and Patterson are both dead, as well as several others who saw it in their possession. Rigdon, yes, but Spalding's wife still lives, and she knew its contents perfectly well. She could not be deceived. Smith, perhaps she might, returned the prophet musingly. I tell you, Rigdon, the more I think of it, the more possible it appears. We must be cautious but vigorous, and I am sure we shall at least create an excitement that will fill our pockets at last, and raise us above those who have scorned us all our lives. Rigdon, here is the manuscript, but use it carefully, and as you value the success of our schemes, let no one see it or know it was ever in your or my possession, and be wary, and not have a vision too often. Or you will, by your overzeal, draw down contempt from even the most ignorant. Long these two worthies communed over this scheme for deception, and when the hours had waned and they had set on a firm basis a train of duplicity that should startle the world, even then, from the depth of their corrupted hearts, gloated over the consternation one day's work had done of their impious fraud. Their only object at that time was to play upon the credulous, earn applause from the debased, and extort money from the simple under the plea of a divine mission, and thus deceive and rob in a mode of which no law could arraign them for the offense. Pride, ambition, and an overweening thirst for power led Smith to concoct the scheme, while the most consummate hypocrisy, which he played off on several denominations of Christians with the hope of rising with the tide, was Rigdon's motive. Honor, integrity, and all the nobler passions of the human heart had been stilled in the breasts of both, and now not remained to stem the newborn crime, which should drag their own names to the depths of infamy and enslave in vice thousands of their fellows. Now clearly we've come some distance from Joseph Smith, whose only expression was one of dullness, whose mental capacities were extremely limited, whose family was known only for the general stupidity. Now he's a consummate schemer, a fiendishly clever deviser of hellish plots. The Hurlbut Howe Spalding theory dominated skeptical explanations of the Book of Mormon for 50 years, from the publication of Mormonism Unveiled in 1834 until 1884. Even the Reverend Alexander Campbell, he who had proclaimed the obvious fact that the book had been composed in one ignorant cranium, soon proclaimed the obvious fact that Spalding of Dartmouth was the author. The theory was not always consistently held, of course. J.B. Turner, for example, wrote that the Book of Mormon was characterized by, quote, uniformity of style in the highest degree. It is all Joe Smith, from preface to finis, testimonials and all. Joe Smith is sole author and proprietor, as he himself claimed on the title page of the first edition. Within just a few paragraphs, however, Turner remarks that although any blunderhead with the Bible at his side might have written the book, and the greater the blunderhead the better, still there are some reasons to believe that Smith is not the original author, even though the gibberish that constitutes the plot of the comedy. And that U-turn was too blatant even for Turner's fellow anti-Mormon Daniel Kidder. It appears to us, Kidder wrote, that Professor T has involved himself in a species of self-contradiction by maintaining that Joe Smith is the real and sole author of the Book of Mormon, while at the same time he proves the identity of that book with the Spalding manuscript. Moreover, he commented, in direct contradiction to both Turner and the Reverend Alexander Campbell, we are far from assenting to the position that unity, either of style or sentiment, prevailed throughout the Mormon Bible. Those who had seen Spalding's manuscript say the religious parts of the Book of Mormon had been added. Now, this reminds me of a story that a friend of mine told me years ago. She had a long discussion at a Christmas party with Richard Feynman. Some of you will remember the name of the very famous Nobel laureate physics professor at Caltech. In the course of it, they were talking about C.S. Lewis, and suddenly Feynman exclaimed that he just loved C.S. Lewis's fiction, except for all that vile religious propaganda. Now, my friend, who was a freshman at the time, took some nerve to go against the Nobel laureate, tried to point out gently that the religious propaganda wasn't just grafted on to Lewis's novels. It was integral to the story. but that's too much for Feynman to get, I guess. Anyway, the idea here is that the Book of Mormon, it was originally a secular book with a little bit of religious stuff thrown in here and there. You can see that, can't you? Now it says these religious parts, this is Kidder writing,